It's not every day you see a wild animal at a funeral, and certainly not one sitting still beside a wooden coffin for hours, as if she knew exactly what had been lost and what was still waiting to be found. Most people assumed she'd leave. After all, bobcats are solitary by nature, skittish, quick to vanish into the trees. But this bobcat didn't move. Her name was Juniper, and what she did next would melt the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. In the quiet hills of Montana, where the snow settles thick and the world slows to a breath, something incredible happened. It wasn't caught on security footage. The news didn't share it. But those who were there say they'll never forget the moment Juniper lifted her head and let out a sound no one expected to hear, not from a wildcat, and certainly not at a funeral. Today you're going to hear the story of a man who gave his life to protect animals. A tiny wildcat baby no one knew existed, and a moment of love so raw it blurred the line between instinct and intention. This isn't just an emotional animal rescue video. It's a story about loyalty, trust, and the unseen bond between humans and wild creatures. So, if you've ever loved a pet like family, wondered how deep animal companionship can go, or believed in miracles where no one else could, stay with me, because what you're about to see may change the way you think about wild animals and about what it means to truly be there for someone, even after they're gone. The chapel was old wooden beams, sun-stained glass, the smell of pine and thyme clinging to every corner. On that morning, it held fewer people than you might expect for a memorial. Just a few neighbors, 2 wildlife rangers, 1 aging vet, and a woman named Caroline, seated in the front row, hands folded in her lap. Her shoulders were pulled back, but her eyes betrayed everything she was trying not to feel. In front of her was a simple casket, unvarnished. Beside it, curled like a statue, Juniper. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't even supposed to be alive when Matthew died. And yet here she was, a wild animal, a bobcat, sitting silently in front of the man who had saved her, watched over her, and some would later say, raised her as much as she had changed him. No chains, no collar, just quiet loyalty. At first, no one said a word. It wasn't just the grief, though there was plenty of that. It was the stillness, the weight in the air, the undeniable feeling that something was happening, even if no one could quite explain what. Bobcats by nature are elusive. You don't see them at bird feeders or lounging in backyards. You certainly don't see them holding vigil beside a coffin. But Juniper had followed the funeral procession without resistance. She had arrived before the others, sat down beside the wood as if she'd claimed the space and stayed. Some guests kept their distance, unsure whether to feel fear or awe. Others whispered softly, "Is that real?" A child reached for his father's hand. Caroline remained still. She knew Juniper wouldn't hurt anyone. That wasn't why the bobcat was there. Juniper didn't pace, didn't growl. She just stayed. Her head tilted downward, amber eyes locked on the wood like she could see through it. Ears upright, her breathing slow. So still she looked, carved from stone. It was the kind of stillness that makes you notice things you usually miss, the way dust dances in morning light, how the wind curls around stained glass, the creak of old pews under shifting weight. And then, hours in, something changed. Her ear twitched. Only slightly, but it was enough to draw a glance from Dr. Grant, the retired wildlife vet who had worked with Matthew for years. He squinted, leaned forward, then nothing. Silence again. Until the exhale. Not a cry, not a growl, just a slow, deliberate breath from Juniper, as if she had reached a decision that only she understood. That's when she stood up. It wasn't fast or frantic, just controlled, intentional. Her muscles uncoiled, slow and steady. She stepped closer to the casket, one paw at a time, claws, retracted pads, whisper soft against the floor. And then she lay back down. But this time her head pressed lightly against the wood. Caroline's eyes welled up. No one moved. And though no one could name it, everyone felt it, that strange current that runs through a room when something sacred is happening and you don't dare interrupt it. There's a reason this story still gets told. Not just because it's rare, Not even because it's emotional, but because it reminds us of something we forget far too easily. Wild doesn't mean heartless. Solitary doesn't mean incapable of love. And sometimes grief isn't expressed in wails or chaos. Sometimes it's expressed in silence, in stillness, in staying put, even when everything else urges you to move on. That day, Juniper stayed for nearly 7 hours. She didn't eat, didn't drink. She just sat beside the one who had once sat beside her day after day through the coldest nights and the deepest fears. It's easy to believe wild animals act on instinct alone, that there's no such thing as animal companionship or emotional intelligence beyond survival. But Juniper didn't come for food. She didn't come for attention. She came because something in her knew that someone was missing. And maybe, just maybe, she was waiting for something else too. A small lesson surfaced quietly for those present. Grief isn't always human. And love doesn't need a leash to be real. One elderly woman said afterward, "I lost my husband 3 years ago. I didn't cry then the way I did watching her." That's the strange power of moments like these. They reach beyond biology, beyond facts, beyond everything we think we know. And they touch something ancient in us, something simple, honest. There's a concept in wildlife rescue called liminal recognition, the moment when an animal crosses the boundary between instinct and intention. It's rare, usually happens in primates, sometimes elephants. But on that cold Montana morning in that modest chapel, a bobcat crossed it too. Caroline later described Juniper's vigil as the quietest roar I've ever heard, and you could almost hear it, her presence echoing louder than any eulogy. Her silence saying what no one else could. Some guests left early. The chapel was cold, and most didn't understand what they were witnessing. But those who stayed saw something shift in Juniper's body language. A faint tension, a flick of the tail, her eyes closed again. And then a noise, not from her, from somewhere else. Faint, muffled, almost imagined. Dr. Grant turned sharply. Caroline froze. Juniper didn't move, but her ears did. She had heard it before anyone else. Her stillness hadn't been about mourning, it had been about listening. That moment, brief as it was, unraveled everything the room believed up to that point, because it suggested something wild, something tender, and something far beyond coincidence. And that right there is where the mystery begins. What came next would challenge science, stir hearts, and call into question everything we think we know about wild animal rescue, survival, and spiritual connection. But to truly understand what Juniper heard, we need to go back to the night that started it all. Because this story didn't begin in a chapel. It began in the middle of a snowstorm, with one man, a nearly frozen bobcat cub, and a decision that would change everything. Long before Juniper lay beside that wooden coffin, before the soft growl and the miracle everyone would talk about, she was just a fragile, half-frozen bundle of fur in the middle of a snow-covered logging trail in Flathead County, Montana. It was early March, years ago now, but the kind of March where winter wasn't ready to let go. The roads were crusted in ice, pines sagged under the weight of the last heavy snow, and Matthew, a quiet man who rarely left the sanctuary without a reason, was driving home from a failed equipment check when he saw something he couldn't ignore. At first, it looked like a scrap of torn coat or discarded trash, but something about the shape tugged at him. He slowed, opened the truck door, and when he knelt beside the mound, what he found was barely alive. A baby bobcat, not much bigger than a man's hand. Bones are visible beneath the fur. No mother in sight. Eyes sealed shut with frozen tears. One paw is twitching. That was all. No one knew how she'd ended up there. A rogue birth. A mother lost to a trap or storm. The forest doesn't offer explanations, only consequences. And this cub, she was on the edge of hers. Matthew didn't pause. He slipped off his flannel shirt, wrapped the cub tight, and tucked her inside his coat. The drive back to the sanctuary was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the steering wheel, as if trying to will life back into something so close to death. He didn't think she'd make it. Later, he'd write in his notebook, "Sometimes you don't save something because you think you can. You save it because you have to try." Back at the sanctuary, he didn't call for backup. No paperwork, no announcements, just action, a heat lamp, a towel-wrapped heating pad, drops of goat's milk on a fingertip. For the first 2 days, she didn't move. Not really. Just tiny, involuntary twitches. He named her Juniper anyway. Not because he expected her to live, but because it felt wrong to let her die without a name. On the 3rd night, her paw pushed weakly against his hand. On the 4th, her eyes opened. And that was the beginning. Not of a rescue, of a relationship. There's a myth that wild animals raised by humans can never return to the wild. That they're broken somehow, tamed like house cats who forget how to hunt. But that's not entirely true. Not always. Matthew knew this. He didn't treat Juniper like a pet. There was no leash, no baby talk. He didn't post photos online or turn her into a novelty. He treated her like a wild thing with space structure and respect. But even in the quietest corners of the sanctuary, something unusual began to grow. When Matthew entered the enclosure, Juniper didn't run. She watched. When he knelt, she crept closer, not in fear, in trust. He never pushed it, just stayed consistent. Some nights, when Montana's wind turned cruel and the temperature dropped, he'd find her curled outside the cabin window, barely visible in the snow. She could have stayed in the den he built, heated and safe. But she didn't. She chose the spot where she could see him. Even the other sanctuary staff noticed. "She tracks him like a shadow," someone said once. It wasn't just training. It wasn't food. It was a connection. One afternoon, a visiting biologist asked to observe Juniper from afar. The woman stood silently behind the fence with a camera, her breath fogging the lens. She muttered to no one in particular, "They're not supposed to bond like that." Matthew, overhearing, replied gently, "You'd be surprised what wild things remember." And maybe that's the lesson too often missed. We assume emotional bonds are for pets, dogs, cats, maybe horses if we're feeling generous. But stories of animal companionship in the wild aren't as rare as we think. Elephants mourn their dead. Orcas carry their stillborn calves for days. Foxes raise orphaned kits that aren't their own. And sometimes, if trust is earned, a wild cat waits by a window just to feel near the one who saved her. What made their story different was that neither tried to own the other. Juniper was never domesticated. She still hunted, still climbed the tallest pines, and hissed at unfamiliar humans. But with Matthew, there was softness, choice. Over the years, the sanctuary saw dozens of rescue animals come and go, injured hawks, abandoned raccoons, even a blind deer. But Juniper remained. She matured, grew into a strong, sleek predator. But even then, when Matthew would do his nightly rounds, she'd follow from a distance, just close enough to be near, just far enough to be free. It wasn't training. It wasn't ownership. It was companionship. The kind that doesn't require words. The kind you feel in your chest more than your mind. Years passed, winters softened, then hardened again. Visitors came and went. The sanctuary upgraded its fencing. Caroline joined the staff. Dr. Grant began mentoring young interns. Juniper became a quiet legend in the valley. No one could quite believe she stayed, but she did. And Matthew never spoke much about that day he found her on the road. When asked, he'd just smile and say, "She's her own story." But he did write about it. Dozens of entries, notes, letters, even a few sketches of her sleeping. In one dated 4 years after her rescue, he wrote, "She still looks at me like I matter. I hope she knows she matters to me too." And maybe that's the small truth. Hiding beneath all the science, wild animal rescue isn't just about survival. It's about meaning. Matthew didn't save Juniper because she was cute, or because the world needed another wildlife rescue emotional video. He saved her because something inside him knew that even wild lives deserve a second chance. And in return, she stayed. Not because she had to, because she chose to. That's rare. If you've ever had a dog, or cat, or even a rescued rabbit who followed you from room to room, not out of dependence but devotion, you know what I mean. That subtle loyalty, that wordless companionship. Now imagine that same bond in a creature most people only glimpse in trail cams. A bobcat, a wild cat baby once too weak to breathe, choosing day after day to remain nearby. It's not common. It's not supposed to happen. But it did, and that made the silence at the funeral all the more powerful. Because those who knew Matthew and Juniper knew them, understood one thing clearly. Her presence wasn't an accident. She wasn't confused, or lost, or tame. She was home. But stories like these don't end neatly. Nature rarely gives us closure. It gives us moments, warnings, and if we're lucky, a whisper of something deeper. The night Matthew didn't return from his last field walk, the staff searched the woods for hours. It wasn't until the next morning that Caroline found Juniper sitting alone at the edge of a frozen trail. Her fur was dusted with frost, her eyes locked on something beyond the trees. She led them straight to him, cold, still, but not alone. Juniper had stayed with him all night, and under his coat, curled into his chest, something moved. Something small. Something alive. But we'll get to that. Because while Juniper's loyalty was breathtaking, what she was guarding was even more mysterious, and the miracle hadn't even begun. Matthew wasn't supposed to be out that late. Not with the storm warning flashing across every screen in Flathead County. Not with the wind already slapping the side of the cabin like a warning. But he had taken the trail anyway, quietly, without telling Caroline, without waking Juniper, without even packing the usual gear. That was the first clue that something was different. The second, he left a letter on the kitchen table folded neatly beside a ceramic mug with a single bobcat whisker resting on the rim. Caroline wouldn't find it until morning, but by then, he was gone. That night, the blizzard rolled in heavier than forecasted. Snow blew sideways. Visibility dropped to near zero. Trees groaned under the weight of ice. Even the birds' ravens mostly had gone silent. Juniper paced. She never did that, not since her early days in the sanctuary. It was subtle at first. A few circles near the front of the cabin. A growl under her breath. Then she disappeared into the storm, leaving behind only paw prints that vanished within minutes. Caroline called Matthew's radio 3 times. No answer. She waited, thinking maybe he was tracking an injured deer again or trying to move trail cameras before the snow buried them. He'd done it before. He always came back. This time he didn't. By dawn, the trail was a mess. 6 inches of new snow. Ice crusted over the lower branches. Caroline took the truck as far as she could, then hiked the rest boots, crunching over places where elk tracks and coyote prints blurred together. Halfway through the upper ridge trail, she found Juniper. The bobcat stood at the edge of a clearing, unmoving. Her body faced the trees. Her head is low, ears pinned. She didn't make a sound when Caroline approached, just looked back once and began walking slowly, deliberately into the woods. That's how they found him. Matthew was slumped against the base of a pine. His coat was drawn tight, covered in snow. Face pale, eyes closed. And tucked against his chest, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, was a newborn bobcat cub, barely moving. Its fur still slick, nose twitching weakly. There's something strange that happens when real life crosses into what feels like storybook magic. Caroline dropped to her knees, checked his pulse. Nothing. Juniper didn't move closer. She just circled once, then lay down a few feet away. Eyes fixed on the tiny bundle rising and falling against Matthew's ribs. The cub was alive. Somehow, just barely. But it had made it through the storm, sheltered by a man who hadn't. Later that morning, Dr. Grant examined the cub and said the odds were 1 in 1,000. If he hadn't covered her like that, she wouldn't have made it through the hour, let alone the night. Back at the sanctuary, everything slowed. There was no time to grieve, not yet. The cub needed heat fluids and quiet. Caroline focused on the immediate thermometer checks, feeding by dropper, tiny blankets layered over a low-watt heating pad. Juniper watched through the glass tail flicking once every few minutes. It wasn't until Caroline sat down at the table that she noticed the letter. Folded, simple. Her name is on the front. Inside, Matthew's handwriting was steady, thoughtful, like he'd written it with care, not panic. If you're reading this, I probably didn't make it back. Please don't worry. I wasn't chasing anything dangerous. I just needed to make sure I wasn't wrong. He explained everything. A few days before he'd noticed signs along the river bend, light paw prints scattered fur, the unmistakable sounds of a distressed animal. He hadn't told anyone. Not because he didn't trust them, but because he didn't want the cub found by someone who didn't understand what it meant. I think she's Juniper's niece, he wrote. Or daughter. It's hard to say. But I knew she'd come looking. She always knew when something was wrong. That line stayed with Caroline. She always knew. There's a theory in wildlife science, still debated, that certain animals maintain intergenerational memory. It's been observed in whales, elephants, even wolves. Some believe it's not just instinct, that the bloodline carries warning wisdom, something deeper. Matthew believed that. He thought Juniper would know when a relative was near, and that she'd do more than remember she'd protect. But why go alone? Caroline reread the last paragraph 5 times. I didn't want this to be loud. I didn't want the press or outsiders or flash photography. If she's out there, if the cub is real, she deserves to be found by someone who understands. Someone willing to die trying. If that ends up being me, tell Juniper I'm not sorry. He signed it simply, "Thank you for loving the things that can't ask to be loved." That letter, though quiet, shook everyone who read it, and it reframed everything. Matthew hadn't just stumbled upon the cub. He knew she was coming. He'd seen the signs, heard the faint yowls through the tree. And rather than wait or bring backup, he went out alone. Not because he was reckless, but he wanted to protect the story before it could be turned into content. This wasn't going to be another cute animal video passed around the internet for clicks. This was legacy. Family. A sacred act of animal rescue. For the next several days, Juniper remained outside the nursery room. She didn't sleep inside, didn't beg for food, just waited. Occasionally, I watched the cub through the glass. Never growling, never pacing. And slowly, the cub who Caroline later named Hope began to stabilize. Her eyes opened. Her mewling grew stronger. She started responding to scent, to temperature, to the quiet rumble of Juniper's low purring just beyond the wall. It was like something ancient was passing between them. People have asked, why didn't Juniper just raise her? She could have. But nature doesn't always rush. She waited for the right moment, and it was clear to everyone she was grieving too. Juniper had lost the man who saved her, but maybe she knew he hadn't left her alone. There's a quote often shared in wildlife rehabilitation circles. Every animal saved is a reminder that life still wants to be here. Matthew had given his last night to one tiny creature. And in doing so, he gave Juniper a new reason to stay. A new connection, a new beginning. And for Caroline, that night wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point. Because the sanctuary wasn't just about animals anymore. It became about remembering. About honoring the invisible bonds between people and wildlife, those quiet, unspoken threads that tug at the heart. Later, Dr. Grant would describe Matthew's death as deliberate in the most selfless way. Not foolish, not romanticized. Just a man making good on a promise to protect what others overlook. That's why Juniper sat by his coffin. She wasn't confused. She understood exactly what had been lost and what had been found. But the story wasn't over yet. Because something strange began to happen the day Hope opened her eyes. Juniper changed. Her posture shifted. Her pacing stopped. And one morning, as the sunrise cast long light across the floorboards, Juniper entered the nursery and lay down beside the cub. Not as a visitor, but as something else entirely. And what happened next surprised even those who thought they'd seen it all. For nearly 7 hours, Juniper hadn't moved. The guests at the chapel in Kalispell had grown used to her presence, at least on the surface. A wild bobcat sitting quietly beside a casket wasn't exactly part of anyone's expectations for a memorial, but after the initial discomfort faded, people settled into their own grief. Some whispered, some prayed. Others stared out the window, searching for something they couldn't name. But Caroline couldn't stop watching Juniper. The way her ears flicked at subtle sounds, the way her tail remained completely still, resting gently against the worn wooden floor. It wasn't the blank stillness of fear or even mourning. It was something else, alertness disguised as calm. Caroline had seen it before, back when Juniper was young. Whenever a storm rolled in or a wounded animal was brought into the sanctuary, Juniper would pause like this. Not out of hesitation, but preparation. Reading something before anyone else did. So when the growl came, it wasn't loud, but it was enough. It started low in Juniper's throat, soft like the sound of wind pushing through dry pine. Just one vibration, barely audible, but it sent a ripple through the room. Heads turned. A child leaned into his mother. A ranger near the door instinctively reached for the radio on his hip. Dr. Grant stood up slowly from the back pew. Did anyone else hear that Juniper didn't growl again? Not right away. Instead, she rose to her feet, shoulders, tense legs steady. She took one slow step forward, then another, and pressed her nose to the base of the casket. That's when the second growl came. This time louder, sharper, not hostile, but insistent. It echoed through the quiet space, catching the air in everyone's lungs. Caroline moved forward, hands clenched. Something's wrong. Someone whispered, maybe she smells him. Maybe she's confused. But this wasn't confusion. Juniper wasn't pacing. She wasn't scanning for threats. Her body was locked on the same position, one front paw raised slightly. Ears pinned forward, tail twitching once in precise rhythm. Her breathing had changed too. Faster, shorter bursts. Those who knew her well are aligned. Dr. Grant, one or two of the long-time volunteers, recognized the stance immediately. It was alert behavior, the same posture she used when a fawn wandered near the boundary fence, or when she heard coyotes howling too close at night. It wasn't fear. It wasn't grief. It was protection. A few of the guests looked to Carolyn, waiting for her to intervene. She stepped forward slowly, kneeling beside Juniper with practiced calm. "What is it, girl?" Juniper didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a single sharp chirp, a sound rarely heard from adult bobcats, typically reserved for high-alert communication. Not aggressive, not soothing, a warning, a signal. Caroline's breath caught. "I've only heard her do that twice," she murmured. "Both times, it meant something was alive." It's worth pausing here to understand what was happening. In most wild cat species, especially bobcats, vocalizations are minimal. They rely more on body language, scent, and environmental reading. But when they do make sound, it matters. Juniper's growl wasn't random. It was diagnostic. Wildlife behaviorists refer to this as responsive signaling, a kind of behavior seen in maternal or hyper-attuned animals when they detect subtle shifts in scent vibration or biological cues from nearby living creatures. Juniper had likely sensed something before anyone else did. Maybe it was movement, maybe warmth, maybe just the smell of breath. But she knew. Inside the room, no one spoke. No one moved. Dr. Grant stepped forward, eyes wide. "Open it." The funeral director hesitated. I don't think..." "Now," Caroline said. "Please." The lid creaked as it lifted, slow, ever cautious. The room leaned forward collectively. Even Juniper stepped back, ears still pinned, tail low. And then a sound, barely more than a breath. A soft, high-pitched whimper. Fragile, muffled. Carolyn reached inside first, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear anything else. Beneath the folds of Matthew's jacket, tucked against his chest, was the smallest bobcat kitten she'd ever seen. Still breathing, eyes sealed, fur matted, mouth open just enough to let out a desperate cry. Juniper let out a long, guttural yowl, not aggressive, not sad, recognition. For a full minute, no one moved. Even the priest stepped back, eyes brimming. Guests covered their mouths, some gasping, others crying softly. It was one of those moments when time didn't just slow, it split. The funeral wasn't over. It had just changed. This wasn't only a story of loss anymore. It was a story of survival. Dr. Grant gently lifted the cub, wrapping it in his scarf with practiced hands. "She's alive," he said more to himself than anyone else. "And she's strong. I don't know how, but she made it." He turned toward Ahori. Caroline, eyes shining. Matthew must have placed her there himself. He must have known. Caroline's voice cracked. Juniper knew first. What followed in the room was more than reaction. It was a revelation. Because the growl hadn't been a threat, it had been a call. Juniper wasn't just mourning Matthew. She had been protecting something. Someone. A tiny life no one else knew existed. One that Matthew had chosen to guard with his final breath. And Juniper had picked up where he left off. There's something powerful about seeing a wild animal act with intention, not just instinct, not hunger or fear or routine, but choice, awareness. Juniper didn't break her silence because she missed him. She broke it because she sensed life. Fragile, unfinished life. And she did what she had always done, stood between that life and the world. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly. A few photos leaked of the cub of Juniper, of the moment the lid opened, but Caroline asked for privacy. Not because she wanted control, but because she wanted respect. "This isn't content," she told a local reporter. "It's connection." The Bobcat cub, later named Hope, survived the critical first 48 hours. Her weight increased, her body temperature stabilized, her breathing steadied. And Juniper remained close, hovering outside the window, circling the door, pacing gently as if tracking something only she could sense. They were connected. The how didn't matter. If there's a takeaway in all this, it might be this. Not all guardians walk on two legs, and not all cries for help come from humans. Sometimes the one who senses it first is the one we least expect. Juniper didn't just guide them to the truth. She warned them. And because someone listened, a new life was saved. But what happened when Juniper met that cub face to face? When instinct and memory collided in one quiet moment, that's where the real miracle began. The sound was faint. A thread-thin cry barely louder than breath, rising from within the folds of Matthew's jacket. If it hadn't been for the stillness in the room, if the guests hadn't been holding their breath, it might have gone unnoticed. But it came. Small, fragile, alive. Caroline's hand trembled as she reached in. Juniper stood stone still beside her, watching with the same quiet focus she used when stalking prey or scanning a tree line. But this wasn't about hunting. This was something else. Nestled against Matthew's chest, tucked deep beneath the second button of his coat, was a wild cat baby, no bigger than a coffee mug. A bobcat kitten. Still alive. Its fur was patchy and damp. Eyes sealed shut, ears were barely developed. It whimpered again, limbs twitching like a new heartbeat finding its rhythm. And though its body was trembling, it hadn't gone cold. Somehow, through a snowstorm, through the bitter grip of a Montana night, this tiny cub had survived. No one in the chapel spoke. The weight of what they were witnessing was too thick for words. Even the priest lowered his head, lips moving silently. Caroline cradled the kitten against her chest and stepped away from the casket. Her scarf, still wrapped loosely around her neck, came off in one motion. She folded it, wrapped it around the cub, and held her close. Juniper followed, step by step. Later, Dr. Grant would explain the science behind it. How a living body, even one nearing death, can preserve another through warmth. How the space between two layers of wool and skin can hold just enough heat to keep a fragile life breathing. How newborn bobcats are born, blind, their survival entirely dependent on instinct, scent, and proximity. But in that moment, no one was thinking about thermoregulation or gestation timelines. They were thinking about one thing. Matthew knew. He hadn't just stumbled into that storm. He hadn't just found the kitten and collapsed with her. He'd wrapped her in his coat, shielded her with his arms. He'd carried her weight with him into the dark, and he'd made sure in his last breath that she wouldn't be alone. The questions came slowly after the ceremony had ended, and the guests filtered out with damp cheeks and quiet hearts. Where had the cub come from? Was it born in the wild? Was it Juniper's? Had Matthew been tracking it for days without telling anyone? Caroline didn't have all the answers, but she remembered the letter, the one she'd found in the cabin. In it, Matthew had written, "I think she's Juniper's kin. Maybe a niece. Maybe more. I'm not certain. But I've seen the signs fur near the birch grove scat under the ridge trail. Something told me this little one was close. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want interference. If I found her, I'd bring her in quietly. And if not, well, it would have been worth the try." He'd added almost as an afterthought, "If she makes it, let Juniper decide what happens next." That line stayed with Caroline. Let Juniper decide. At the sanctuary that evening, the air was heavy with snow and silence. The small staff had returned early, alerted by a short radio call from Dr. Grant. They cleared a space in the infirmary. Fresh blankets, heating pads, a humidifier to help the cub breathe more easily. Caroline sat beside the table holding Hope. Yes, that's what they called her now in her arms. The cub's eyes were still closed, but her whimpers were steady. Not panicked, just present. Juniper sat behind the glass door, unmoving. She hadn't left Caroline's side since the funeral. Not when they drove back. Not when the wind picked up again. Not even when the staff moved in and out with supplies. Her gaze never left the cub. There's a term used by animal behaviorists, liminal guardianship. It describes animals that begin to adopt caretaking roles toward others, especially when there's no clear biological incentive. It's been seen in dogs fostering kittens, in elephants guarding injured calves that aren't theirs, in ravens feeding young owlets after storms. But bobcats almost never. They're known to be fiercely solitary, especially females. After raising their own litters, they part ways and rarely, if ever, reunite with kin. Their social bonds are weak, brief, and often fleeting. But Juniper wasn't behaving like a typical wildcat. She was waiting, watching. And when Carolyn finally opened the door to the infirmary, Juniper stepped inside with the grace and confidence of someone who already knew where she was needed. No one stopped her. She approached the table, placed her front paws gently on the edge, and stared at the cub. Hope let out a short cry. Juniper blinked once, then twice, and without growling or chirping or moving away, she lowered her head and touched her nose to the cub's back. It was brief. A second, maybe two, but it was enough. She stepped back, lay down near the corner of the room, and closed her eyes. Caroline watched with her heart in her throat. "She's accepting her," she whispered. Dr. Grant nodded. More than that. She's guarding her. It wasn't some magical transformation. Juniper didn't suddenly become domestic or maternal in the human sense. She didn't pick up Hope or lick her clean or do the things most people associate with parenting. But she stayed. That was the miracle. Because in the wild, survival is not just about food or shelter. It's about presence. Who stays when they don't have to? Juniper didn't have to be there. No one asked her, no one trained her. She wasn't raised to do this. She chose it. In the days that followed, Hope grew stronger. Her mewling became sharper. She began to respond to sound, to warmth, to movement, and always, always Juniper was near. Never too close, never too far. She would pace the nursery when the heat lamp dimmed. She would growl gently when unfamiliar scents entered the room. She would sit by the door for hours, staring into the trees as if daring anything to approach. The staff took shifts. Caroline barely slept, Dr. Grant scribbled notes obsessively, trying to catalog what they were witnessing without overstepping its quiet magic. It was more than animal rescue. It was animal love. And perhaps something even deeper, an echo of loyalty that didn't end when Matthew's heart stopped beating. Because here's the thing, Hope wasn't just a cub. She was the final piece of something larger. A living thread tying past to present, wild to human, memory to meaning. She was what Matthew had saved, what Juniper now protected, and what the sanctuary had become not just a place to heal, but a place to remember. There's a phrase Caroline once read in a field journal from another sanctuary years ago, and it returned to her as she watched Juniper curl her tail slightly toward Hope's incubator. When one life chooses another, the wilderness makes room. Hope was never meant to survive, but she did, because Matthew gave her warmth, because Juniper gave her watchfulness, because love, real love, the kind that expects nothing and costs everything, had made space. And yet even now, something deeper was beginning to unfold, because while Hope had found protection, she hadn't yet found her place. That would come next, when Juniper made a choice no one expected, a choice that would change both of their lives forever. Caroline didn't read the letter right away. It sat on the table near the wood stove, folded neatly untouched for nearly 2 days. She wasn't ready. Not with Hope's condition still uncertain, not with Juniper lying silently in the nursery corner, her eyes dull with grief and something else, watchfulness maybe. Something deeper. But late on the second night, when the wind outside was quiet and the cub's breath had steadied into soft, rhythmic puffs against a flannel blanket, Caroline unfolded the paper and read the last thing Matthew ever wrote. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back." Her hands went still. The letter continued, "Don't panic. I wasn't being reckless. I didn't go out chasing anything I couldn't handle." But I heard her. I know I did. That sharp cry bobcats make when they're lost, when they're calling into nothing. It was faint, but it was real. So I followed it. I left at dusk, hoping I'd beat the storm. I didn't, but I found her. He described the cub in careful detail, her size, her wet fur, the faint flicker of life in her chest. He wrote about wrapping her in his coat, tucking her close to his heart, how he whispered to her the entire time, not out of hope, but out of instinct, like maybe if she heard a steady voice, she'd stay. Then came this line, "I didn't bring her back to the cabin because I didn't think I could make it that far. But I thought maybe Juniper would know. She always knows." Caroline exhaled slowly. She could picture it now. Matthew kneeling in the snow, wind cutting sideways, sheltering a kitten beneath layers of wool, and Hope trusting a bobcat to finish what he'd started. The rest of the letter wasn't dramatic. It didn't romanticize anything, but it was deliberate. "If she survives, I want her raised with care, not spectacle. Don't let her become a headline. Don't put her in front of cameras. Let her be wild, or at least something close to it. Let Juniper decide how close she needs to be. There's a reason I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't want to draw attention. Not yet. We lose something every time we rush to make wildness digestible." This was supposed to be quiet. That line hit hard. We lose something every time we rush to make wildness digestible. Caroline folded the letter for a moment and just sat there, staring at the fire, the way it swayed gently in the stove's belly like a breath being held. And she realized what Matthew had always tried to protect wasn't just animals, it was the integrity of their stories, their space to just be without needing to entertain or explain. It wasn't a coincidence that this letter had come from the same man who once refused a national news outlet's offer to film Juniper's recovery. "She's not a mascot," he'd said. "She's a miracle." Caroline unfolded the letter again. "If you have this paper, it means Juniper made it back. I hope she's watching over the little one. I hope they remember each other somehow. There's more going on in the animal world than we know. People think rescue animals are lucky to be saved. But most days I feel like I'm the lucky one because they let me be close. Let me witness something bigger than myself." That was Matthew. Never self-important, never above the animals he cared for. Always learning, always listening. Caroline kept reading. "Tell Dr. Grant I finally believe him about scent bonding and bobcats. Hope I'm calling her that by the way smelled like Juniper. That's why I followed her cry. There was something familiar in it. I don't know if they're related by blood, but there's something deeper there. Something wild animals seem to understand better than we do. Maybe it's recognition, maybe it's memory, or maybe it's just love." Caroline stopped again. There was a lesson buried in those lines, not about science or rescue technique, but about perspective. About how humans always seem to want to define everything, categorize, label, explain. But some bonds defy naming. Some connections can't be diagrammed. What mattered was that Juniper had known the cub was near, and she had chosen to stay. Matthew ended the letter simply, "If she lives, raise her with honesty. Let her be wild where she can and protected where she must. But never forget, she's not yours. She's just passing through. And so are we. Take care of each other. Take care of her. And tell Juniper thank you for everything." Carolyn folded the paper, slowly slid it into a clean envelope, and placed it in the small box where Matthew used to keep handwritten notes about each rescued animal. She sat for a while in silence, just breathing. She wasn't alone. Juniper was curled near the door, eyes open, gaze steady. Not watching the fire or the wind outside, but watching Hope, who had begun to stretch her limbs in slow, clumsy movements. There was something sacred about that room, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented: a man's final promise. A cub's first breath, a bond between creatures the world still struggled to understand. The next morning, Olivia arrived. Matthew's granddaughter. She hadn't been at the funeral. Flights had been delayed, then grounded altogether, but she came as soon as the roads opened. She didn't cry when Caroline handed her the letter. She read it all the way through, standing quietly beside Juniper, who didn't flinch or move. When she finished, she knelt beside the Bobcat and whispered, "Thank you for finding her." Juniper leaned forward, brushed Olivia's sleeve with her nose, and closed her eyes again. Later that week, Olivia recorded a voice memo in the sanctuary's guest book. It wasn't a formal tribute, more of a reflection. She said, "I grew up thinking my grandpa just worked with animals. Now I understand he lived with them. Loved them in a way that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with listening. Hope is more than a rescued animal. She's the echo of everything he believed." That was the moment Caroline knew the sanctuary would change. Not expand, not modernize, but evolve. They wouldn't become a rescue center with rotating volunteers and a gift shop and sponsorship badges. They'd stay small, intimate, focused on wildlife rescue, but also something deeper: animal companionship, wild animal healing, and the quiet, difficult work of giving wild creatures room to be themselves. And maybe, just maybe, they'd help people heal too. Matthew's letter wasn't dramatic, but it was everything. It gave shape to the silence, words to loyalty, permission to grieve, and guidance on how to move forward. Juniper didn't need to read it. She already knew. But for those left behind, for Caroline, for Olivia, for the few who stayed long after the cameras lost interest, it was a map. One not of where to go next, but of how to be next. And as the cub stirred that evening, stretching with more confidence, letting out a soft, breathy chirp, Juniper responded, not with sound, but with presence. She stepped closer, lay beside the small crate, and rested her head near Hope's tiny frame. Not as a guardian, not as a mother, but as something in between, and the miracle was just beginning to unfold. No one told Juniper what to do next. There were no commands, no cues, no reward, just the sound of Hope's tiny breath rising and falling in the blanket-lined crate. The kitten had begun to gain strength slowly, steadily. Her legs were stronger, her eyes almost open, her hunger louder each day. And Juniper never left her side. She didn't hover, she didn't pace. She simply stayed nearby, watching, listening, responding in her own quiet way. Sometimes she slept curled near the door, sometimes at the foot of the crate. But when Hope cried, Juniper moved, every time, as if pulled by a thread only she could feel. And that's when the shift began. One morning, as Caroline prepared the morning feeding, warming milk, checking Hope's temperature, she looked up to find Juniper inside the enclosure, not just watching, nuzzling. Hope's face was buried against Juniper's chest, the kitten's tiny paws pressed against her fur, rooting instinctively. And Juniper didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, then lowered her head and began grooming the cub in slow, rhythmic strokes, just like a wild mother would. Caroline froze. "Doctor." Grant, watching through the glass, whispered, "It's happening." This wasn't just affection. It was an adoption. Bobcats are notoriously independent. In the wild, mothers raise their litters alone, and once the cubs are weaned, the bond fades quickly. There are no second chances, no cross-fostering, no adoption from outside the litter. But here was Juniper, a semi-wild adult female with no confirmed blood relation to the cub, taking on the role without hesitation. Cleaning, warming, guarding. Every day the behavior deepened. She began sleeping closer to the crate. Her ears would flick toward Hope's cries even when she seemed asleep. And eventually she did what no one expected. She blocked the entrance to the enclosure from anyone unfamiliar. Volunteers had to wait for Caroline to enter first. Even the sanctuary's youngest dog, normally allowed to roam freely, was met with a firm growl from Juniper when he ventured too close. This wasn't just instinct, it was intentional. From a scientific perspective, Dr. Grant documented every moment, filming, taking notes, even logging Hope's progress compared to rescued bobcat litters raised in isolation. The difference was clear. Hope was calmer, more engaged. Her response to scent and movement was sharper. She gained weight faster. Her eyes opened fully by week 4, several days ahead of schedule. "Having Juniper here isn't just emotional support," he said. "It's biological enrichment. It's making her stronger." Caroline, on the other hand, saw something else. She saw healing. Because Juniper hadn't been the same since Matthew died. Her movements had been slower. Her eyes are cloudier. But with Hope close by, her energy returned. Her posture straightened. Her gaze grew more focused. The stillness that had once read as grief now looked like calm authority. She wasn't just watching the cub. She was becoming whole again. One morning, Caroline stepped into the nursery to find the crate empty. Panic surged for a moment until she spotted them both curled in the corner. Hope was nestled beneath Juniper's chest, tucked under one front leg. Juniper blinked slowly as Caroline entered, then lowered her head, resting it gently over the cub's back. No hiss, no protest, just presence. There's a quiet lesson in all this. Rescue isn't always loud. It isn't always a siren or a rush of hands or a dramatic transformation. Sometimes it's slow, quiet, gentle. Sometimes rescue looks like staying near, watching, offering warmth when nothing else makes sense. Juniper never tried to replace Matthew. She didn't try to parent in a human sense. What she offered was something simpler: belonging. Hope, in turn, began to mirror Juniper's behaviors. She tracked movement with her ears first, not her eyes. She crouched low before exploring. She let out short, stuttering chirps when she woke up, sounds almost identical to the ones Juniper had made weeks earlier. It was wild animal companionship in its purest form. Instinct shared through attention, not training. To those outside the sanctuary, it might have looked like just another cute animal video, a baby bobcat cuddling with an older one. But to those who understood the behavior, the wildlife biologists, the volunteers, the conservationists, this was something else entirely. It was a redefinition of family, of survival, of what it means to heal. Even Olivia, who'd only recently stepped into the rhythm of sanctuary life, found herself watching them through the glass for hours. She said one evening, "It's like they knew each other before they met." Caroline smiled. Maybe they did. Not all wildlife rescue stories end this way. Sometimes the cub doesn't survive. Sometimes the bond never forms. Sometimes the trauma runs too deep. But Hope and Juniper found a middle path between instinct and intimacy, between solitude and sanctuary. That middle space, that's where the miracle lived. And as spring edged closer, as the snow began to melt and the sanctuary filled with birdsong again, something shifted for everyone. Juniper began leading Hope outside. First, just a few steps into the enclosure, then further to the shaded area near the fence where Matthew used to sit. then toward the tall pine near the boundary where Juniper used to sleep during warmer months. Hope followed with awkward curiosity, stumbling, pouncing, retreating, then leaping again. And Juniper. She let her, corrected her with a nudge when she strayed too far, nipped gently when she tried to climb too high, not to stop her, to teach her. That's what struck Caroline most. Juniper hadn't just become a protector, she had become a mentor. By late spring, Hope was exploring independently for brief windows of time. Her coat had thickened her stride, more confident, and though she still returned to Juniper's side each evening, her curiosity stretched further each day. It was the start of something new, a life not defined by rescue but by resilience. And Juniper. She remained unchanged in one important way. She still chose to stay. No enclosure, no tether, no confinement. Every morning she could have walked away into the woods, disappeared into the wild, the way most bobcats eventually do. But she didn't. She came back. To Hope, to Caroline, to the sanctuary that had once saved her. That's the quiet gift of animal rescue. It often returns itself in ways no one expects. And yet, even with the progress, even with the joy of watching a cub grow wild and strong beneath the guidance of a once wild mother, Caroline couldn't shake a lingering thought. There was something more to this story, something that hadn't yet revealed itself, and she wasn't alone in feeling it. Because word had begun to spread, not just among neighbors or volunteers, but further, online, through whispers, shared photos. A growing ripple of people asking, "Is that the same Bobcat? The one from the funeral?" Donations trickled in. Messages of support. Stories from people who'd lost loved ones and somehow found comfort in the strange sacred way Juniper had stood vigil. Hope was no longer just a cub. She was a symbol. And what happened next would ripple far beyond the sanctuary gates. Hope never asked to be a symbol. She was just a bobcat cub, abandoned, rescued, wrapped inside a man's final breath and raised beneath the quiet watch of another who had once been abandoned herself. But as spring turned into summer and word of her survival made its way through the small town of Kalispell, something unusual happened. People began showing up, not for tours or photos. They came quietly, with letters, candles, stones with names carved into them, drawings from children. A woman drove 6 hours from Idaho just to leave a small handmade bracelet on the sanctuary gate. For the little one, she said, and the man who kept her warm. No one had advertised the story. The sanctuary had no PR team, just a few volunteers and a basic website. But someone posted a photo. Juniper curled beside Hope, both eyes closed, their fur overlapping. A journalist picked it up, then a teacher, then someone on a wildlife rescue forum. Within weeks, the sanctuary's inbox was filled. Emails from parents, veterans, retired teachers, people who'd lost spouses, pets, parents, people who'd never heard of Flathead County before, but who felt something stir inside when they read about a wild cat baby, a grieving bobcat, and a letter from a man who believed in quiet miracles. One message read, "This reminded me of my mom's hands, how she held me when I was sick. I haven't thought about that in 20 years. Another simply said, "I didn't know I needed to cry until I did." Caroline and Olivia printed out every message and pinned them to a corkboard inside the supply shed. Before long, the wall filled, then overflowed. Dr. Grant moved the feed inventory and built new space for what he started calling the heartboard. What surprised them most weren't the volume of messages, it was the tone. People weren't reacting to drama. They weren't chasing headlines. They were responding to the stillness of the story. The gentleness, the honesty. A wild animal rescue story without shock, without spectacle. Just a bobcat who stayed. A cub who lived. A man who didn't come back but left something behind. And then came the fundraiser. It started small, Olivia's idea. A way to raise enough money to expand the bobcat habitat and add an additional medical bay. She made a short video, 5 minutes, just her voice over footage of Hope and Juniper with Matthew's letter woven through. The video ended with a simple line, "If this story made you feel something, help us give wild animals a place to heal." They posted it quietly. One link on the sanctuary page. No promotion. It reached 70,000 views in 3 days. By the end of the week, donations had passed the initial goal 5 times over. They raised enough to protect an additional 400 acres of land bordering the sanctuary, wild, undeveloped forest, where future rescues could be reintroduced safely. A place Matthew had once dreamed of acquiring. They named it Juniper Ridge. And on a cool morning in June, Caroline and Olivia walked the land with a small wooden sign etched by hand. Let them choose the path. Just keep it safe. That had been one of Matthew's favorite sayings. The ripple kept growing. Local schools asked to include Hope's story in their environmental science curriculum. A non-profit donated a trail cam system to monitor future Bobcat releases. Retired wildlife officers began offering training sessions for volunteers. One man, a former combat medic, drove up from Texas to help build new fencing. He said it gave him a reason to believe in kindness again. Dr. Grant, who had long resisted attention, wrote his first article for a wildlife journal. The title, Instinct, Intuition, and the Intergenerational Memory of Love. And through it all, hope kept growing. She hunted her first field mouse, climbed her first pine tree, vanished into the underbrush, then reappeared hours later, Juniper trailing silently behind. The once tiny cub who couldn't lift her head now stood with confidence muscles, strong, eyes alert, still sleeping at Juniper's side when dusk fell. She was never caged, never collared. She chose to stay. That's what made people believe. Because the truth is, this wasn't just a cute animal video. It wasn't just about a wildcat baby or a loyal bobcat companion. It wasn't even about animal rescue, at least not entirely. It was about what happens when one life chooses another, and what we choose to do with the time we're given. Matthew didn't live to see the world change because of his decision. He didn't know his letter would reach thousands. He didn't know his quiet act would become a cause, but maybe in some part of him, he suspected. He knew the value of staying close, of trusting that even the smallest kindness could ripple outward. There's a lesson here, one that goes beyond bobcats or wildlife or sanctuaries. It's about presence, the decision to sit beside someone in silence, to offer warmth when you have no words, to hold space for healing even when you don't understand the wound. That's what Juniper did for Matthew, what Matthew did for Hope, what Hope now does simply by being for so many who watch her and feel something shift inside. Somewhere out there, a person who's never set foot in Montana is planting milkweed for the first time because they watched this story. Someone else is adopting an older dog. Someone is picking up the phone and calling a father they haven't spoken to in years. The ripple moves, and it matters. If you're still here, if you've watched this far, it means something in you responded to this story. Maybe it reminded you of a pet you once loved. Maybe it stirred a memory of being held. Maybe it made you wonder what you would have done that night in the snow. Whatever it was, don't let it fade. Let it change something in how you notice the world, in how you show up for others, in how you stay even when staying is quiet and hard. And if this story did touch something in you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that hope is still out there. Not always loud, not always easy, but real and still worth protecting.